All right, so in this video, I'm going to share some very basic tips when it comes to sanding. I think a lot of people don't really care for sanding too much, myself included, and that's because a long time I was just going about it the wrong way. So I want to share a few tips that hopefully will help you out. So what we have here is just a random test board. I've made some pencil lines on it, but it's in a pretty rough state. So it makes sense in a situation like this to start at the lowest grit possible. And why do you do that? Well, you do that because it's going to remove more material much faster. And if you're somebody that doesn't care for sanding too much, that's kind of what you want to do. And what I mean by that is here I have different grits of sandpaper, from the lowest up to the highest over here. So we're going to take the lowest grit, in this case being 80. We're going to go ahead and place that on our sander. And now from here, because I want to remove the most material, let's use an example. If you had two boards that were glued up together, and maybe you need to take that down a little bit to smooth everything out. It's going to be a lot faster with a more aggressive grit. Don't be afraid that it's going to ruin the work surface. It's designed this way for a reason. So when we go ahead and sand, there's a couple of key things that a lot of people, I think, avoid. One of the benefits to having a dust extractor that has variable suction is that you don't want that suction to be cranked all the way up. If you're able to turn that down, it's going to provide a couple of different things. The first thing it's going to provide is not pulling that sander down into the workpiece, which is going to, one, make your sander a lot more aggressive in pulling that into the wood, but it's going to wear that paper out faster. So what you want to do is you want to break that surface tension, and having the ability to be able to dial that back is a great benefit. So then the sander is essentially just floating over the workpiece. The second thing I want to point out is you don't need to apply a lot of pressure. Again, that's why we want to start with a lower grit. Now, in terms of sanding on the actual board itself, I'm always going to start and move from one end to the other, moving with the grain, and the whole time not applying a lot of pressure. Again, we want that sander to be floating on the work surface. So let's go ahead and make a couple of quick passes. So one other thing that I want to highlight is when you're moving with the sander, you don't want to be super aggressive in terms of how fast you move it side to side or back and forth in whatever the scenario is. But you kind of just want to move nice and slow, about an inch per second, and really just take your time to allow that sandpaper to do what it's designed to do. So now, what's the next step? Well, the next step, obviously, is to rip this sandpaper off and go to the highest, because we hate sanding, right? No, that's wrong. You don't want to skip grits. Right? So the purpose of incremental grits as you move through the sandpaper is that we used 80 to get the majority of that material off. It's going to save us a ton of time sanding later. The problem is, because of the more aggressive paper, it's going to leave more aggressive scratch patterns. So if you jump way up and go to something like 180 from 80, the problem that you're going to have is removing that scratch pattern. So that's where taking small increments through comes into play. So we had 80, then we're going to move to 120. Once we get done with 120, we're going to move to 150, so on and so forth, to whatever grit you feel comfortable with stopping. Now, if we're going to go ahead and put this 120 on real quick, I can just go ahead at this point and put this sandpaper on and just start sanding, right? No, and that's another common mistake that people make. While we do have dust extraction, and it is pulling that material through the sander into the dust extractor, there's a lot of times where you're going to have material left on the surface. Matter of fact, I can rub my hand over this right now, and I can actually feel some of that. What that is the natural breaking down of that sandpaper. So in between any grits, you always want to make sure you go back and wipe that surface down. That doesn't have to be anything fancy. You can just use a simple cloth, wipe that down. The other option is to use something like the dust extractor to make sure that you get all of that material off the piece. So a vital part to having a really nice finish is making sure that that material is nice and clear before you step up to that next grit. So whether it's vacuuming off, whether it's wiping it off, just to make sure that none of the previous residue is left on that surface. So those are some tips that are going to help hopefully give you a better sanding experience and a better finish on your next project.